Rolling through time, the surprisingly bumpy journey of the Wheelie Suitcase. Rolling luggage looked strange back then, unfitting for a serious traveller. Boardrooms doubted anyone, especially men, would use it. And yet, one man's persistence proved them wrong. This is the story of why a world tired of heavy bags needed decades before agreeing it was okay to roll instead of carry. I'm really glad you're here. Thank you for letting me keep you company as the day winds down. Before we begin, take a moment to make yourself comfortable. If you're sitting, let your back rest fully against the chair. If you're lying down, let the weight of your head sink into the pillow. Loosen your shoulders. Let your hands rest where they fall naturally. Take a slow breath in and let it out, feeling the day drift a little further away. There's nothing you need to do now. Just let the story come to you. For the next little while, we'll wander through airports of the past, meet inventors with curious eyes, and trace the long shift from clumsy trunks to the smooth roll you know today. To begin, we should step back and see what travel looked like before wheels entered the picture. A world before wheels. Did you know that for most of history luggage was carried in arms or balanced on shoulders, sometimes passed to hired porters who worked in stations and hotels? For centuries, travel often meant paying those helpers, bellhops, skycaps, young men in pressed uniforms whose job was to haul trunks and cases. By the middle of the 20th century, that picture began shifting. Mass tourism expanded, and reliance on hired help declined. More travellers were expected to move their own bags, a change that made the weight of luggage feel more personal than ever. The wheel already carried carts and strollers, but no one had yet thought it proper to attach one directly to a suitcase. If you picture an airport around 1968, the difference from today is striking. No low murmur of wheels on tile. Instead, rough sounds echoed in every direction, clasps rattling, wooden handles scraping floors, bags dropped for a moment and scooped up again. In those crowded halls, simple tasks looked like quiet struggles. A father shifted his toddler onto one hip, the other arm clenched around two stiff bags, his knuckles white. A grandmother in a neat coat tried to keep pace on a stairway, pausing halfway up to catch her breath before pressing forward. These were ordinary scenes repeated by millions of travellers every year, moments that appeared invisible at the time but carried real weight. The bags themselves explained some of the difficulty. Earlier trunks were built like furniture, wood planks, leather wraps, brass corners, made to protect but never to lighten. Later suitcases took on a smaller shape yet kept the same heavy language of design. Leather panels, solid frames, metal locks and dense cloth stretched across stiff forms. To own one was a mark of respectability, proof of means and reliability. A bag that looked sturdy seemed to promise that your trip was worth carrying, but that appearance always brought extra pounds with it. Social rules added another layer. Men were expected to carry without showing strain, while women were offered help more easily, though many still wanted to demonstrate their independence. Taking a porter's assistance was seen as a matter of choice rather than necessity, and often an indulgence. To manage on your own was a measure of endurance. In this way, luggage became more than a container. It was a subtle test of character performed at every station and gate. Meanwhile, air travel itself was expanding at record speed. Airports stretched wider with the arrival of jet aircraft, their concourses growing to handle swelling crowds. Passenger counts exploded, with annual air travellers rising from about 17 million in 1949 to more than 170 million by 1969. That growth meant long walks between parking lots, ticket counters, gates and claim areas, routes far longer than the compact train stations and small airfields of decades past. Airlines promised glamour in glossy posters, yet the reality on the ground was a parade of tired passengers trudging with bags that never grew lighter. You can imagine the burden in small, everyday vignettes. A business traveller in a tight suit carried a hard leather case alongside him, its boxy shape unforgiving. Boarding meant leaning his body beneath the weight to wrestle it into an overhead bin, hoping it wouldn't slip and strike someone else. A mother close by balanced an infant against her shoulder while dragging two cases unevenly in her grip. Her pace slowed, feet scuffing across the floor, and her arms ached long before she even reached her seat. These were ordinary sights, part of the rhythm of every concourse, so familiar they drew little notice. What makes it all the more curious is that wheels were already everywhere. Barrels rolled smoothly along docks. Baby strollers were pushed through parks. Handcarts carried crates far heavier than any suitcase. Yet the thought of adding wheels to personal luggage seemed either awkward or simply unnecessary. For many, travel was meant to include effort. The uneven clatter of footsteps and bags was almost a soundtrack people accepted without question. To imagine doing it differently required stepping outside that routine. The shape of luggage also carried its own inertia. Flat bottoms allowed cases to stand upright. Rigid sides protected folded clothing. Short handles made them neat to carry, if not comfortable. Manufacturers leaned into these traditions, continuing to design thick-sided leather boxes with reliable locks, because that was what travelers believed dependable luggage should look like. Customers valued strength over convenience, and changing that meant trading away features people trusted. Adding wheels looked less like an innovation and more like a compromise. The result was a clear mismatch. By the early 1970s, airlines could cross oceans overnight and airports sprawled across vast acres, but passengers were stuck with bags designed for a smaller world. Families, business people, grandparents alike walked farther, stooped lower, and arrived at the counter already stiff and weary. Posters spoke of the elegance of flying into the future, yet the very objects in travellers' hands pulled them back into the past. This was the landscape waiting for something new. Travel in the mid-century was at once glamorous and exhausting. Modern planes paired with outdated luggage. Despite the wheel's long and obvious history, no one had successfully fastened it onto a suitcase in a way the public accepted. The idea lingered, faint and unresolved, hidden under the noise of daily journeys. And this is where the story grows even more intriguing. People had tried before. Small inventions flickered into existence, clever, unusual, sometimes ahead of their time, but each effort slipped away. It can feel surprising that something so obvious today never seemed to catch on then, and yet the record shows how often societies blinked past the same idea. Earlier, glimmers of wheels. Even before rolling suitcases became normal, a few faint signals appeared. These were not mass-market shifts, but scattered efforts, a patent here, a personal experiment there, an accessory advertised for a season. Some ideas made it onto paper, others into living rooms or store shelves. None lasted long. What we notice looking back is that the thought of adding wheels surfaced again and again, but the world surrounding it was not yet ready. One of the earliest traces comes from 1921, when Theophilus Hockennan filed a US patent application for a wheeled valise. His drawings showed a plain, box-like suitcase with rollers added underneath. In outline, it reads almost exactly like what airports would one day accept. Yet, in the 1920s, most long-distance travel was by train, where lines of porters handled bags as part of the service. For wealthy travellers, carrying weight was someone else's problem. For others, lifting their own suitcase was simply expected. Hockenen's design answered a question most people weren't asking, so it stayed where it started, in the patent record. A few years later, in 1928, writer Anita Willets Burnham set out on journeys with her children. In her notes, she mentioned using a trunk she had modified with wheels, a kind of homemade solution to spare herself the worst lifts. It wasn't a product, wasn't patented, and no company picked it up. It was just one family's way of making things easier. Still, it revealed that some travellers already felt the strain strongly enough to improvise, even if that ingenuity ended quietly at the edge of their own hallway. By the middle of the century, a new wave of accessories tried to win attention. In 1949, an American company offered something under the name Portable Porter, a clip-on wheel kit designed to fasten to the base of an ordinary case. Advertisements showed smiling passengers tugging bags with ease, a small fantasy of moving faster and lighter. But the devices clattered, wore out quickly, and added cost. Many buyers owned suitcases built to last years, and few saw reason to bolt a shaky set of wheels onto them. The Portable Porter soon faded, remembered mostly in a handful of ads. 2 decades later, in 1963, a product called the Rolly Case appeared in the United Kingdom. Unlike the awkward kits, this was designed as a full suitcase with wheels built into its frame. It rolled more smoothly and reflected the changing scale of airports. Yet even this attempt came across as more novelty than solution. Business travellers felt it looked unserious, like a toy. For holidaymakers, it was too odd and too new to replace the sturdy bags they trusted. Sales remained small, and the Rolly Case slipped out of sight. When we pause across these examples, a pattern emerges. Some people filed patents, sketched ideas, or adapted trunks at home. A handful of products even made it to market, but the broader culture resisted. Much of the hesitation had little to do with the engineering, and more to do with travel customs. At stations and early airports, porters were still visible, their work folded tightly into the idea of travelling well. At the same time, cultural expectations played a quiet part. Men were supposed to carry without strain. Women who used wheels risked being viewed as fussy. Later commentators connected this slow adoption to such attitudes. Travellers avoided wheeled bags not because they failed, but because they sent the wrong social signals. Manufacturing and economics added another break. Making luggage with built-in rollers meant retooling factory lines for goods that might not sell. Suitcases were already expensive items meant to last for years. To replace one with an untested design risked ridicule as well as expense. For companies, investing heavily in the concept promised little reward. For consumers, it meant buying something that might only attract stares in a hotel lobby. As a result, manufacturers rarely promoted wheeled models strongly, and the public never grew used to seeing them. By the mid-1960s, these scattered sparks had repeated enough times to create a vague outline. Wheels on luggage were possible, sometimes even available, but rarely accepted. A few travellers glimpsed the convenience, yet most stuck with tradition, and so the idea hovered, waiting. All of this set the stage for the moment when everyday conditions had changed enough to matter. Airports were stretching wider, passenger crowds swelling, and carrying bags was no longer a choice but a burden everyone felt directly. The faint glimmers of the past still lingered quietly in patent archives and in personal stories, but what mattered now was how ordinary people actually experienced travel day after day. The pressure was building, waiting for one person at the right place and time to see the familiar problem in a new way. And it is here, under the glare of heat, in the tired shuffle of passengers through a crowded terminal, that the story tips into something different. Bernard Sadow's hot airport moment. Imagine stepping off a plane after a long holiday, the kind that leaves your arms marked by straps and your bag swollen with souvenirs that already feel too heavy. The air pressed warm around the crowd as passengers filed into the terminal. Suitcases scraped along the floor, leather handles dug into palms, and each step grew slower under the strain. Somewhere in that tide of weary movement walked Bernard Sadow, his own shoulders sore, his own grip slipping. The space itself carried its own rhythm. Luggage carts clattered in the distance, metal trunks landed with dull thuds, and overhead speakers echoed messages across the cavernous hall. Mixed with that machinery was the sigh of people shifting their loads, pulling at coat collars or pausing to rest before pushing on again. Everyone laboured in near silence, as if to carry this weight was just an accepted part of travel. Sadow moved like the rest, two bulging cases tugging at each arm. His shirt clung damp with heat. He watched others struggle just as he did, people trading bags from one hand to the other, blinking sweat from their eyes, trying to keep pace with families or lines. This was the ordinary picture of flying in that era. No one looked for alternatives, and yet something ordinary drew his attention. Not far away, a worker guided cargo across the terminal floor, not by lifting, but by steering a low dolly on solid wheels. The load rolled easily, the man barely straining to keep it going forward. That contrast spoke loudly. The same weight that bent the arms of travellers slid almost effortlessly when placed on wheels. Standing in the middle of the terminal, Sadow felt the thought form with clarity. If freight could glide on a rolling cart, why not luggage? His own cases, so difficult in hand, could ride against the ground if equipped with small wheels of their own. An answer to a problem everyone tolerated stood right in front of him. Back at home, the idea followed him like an echo. He fetched a suitcase, set it on its side, and fitted 4 small casters to its base. Instead of designing a new handle, he attached a simple strap that allowed him to tow the bag at an angle. It was rough, but it moved. When pulled across the hallway, the casters rattled against seams in the floor, yet the suitcase rolled forward instead of dragging. That sound alone marked something different. Weight guided by wheels rather than carried entirely by arms. Picture that first trial at home. A narrow hallway, rugs pressed thin against the boards, and one man tugging a lopsided case in front of him. His wife glanced toward the noise, lifting an eyebrow as the luggage clattered past. Her look carried curiosity and a touch of doubt. The picture must have seemed unusual, even strange. Still, behind the awkwardness stood a practical truth. The bag had learned to roll. It was far from polished. The casters tipped whenever the case turned. The strap twisted uncomfortably. Any seam jolted the bag sideways. Yet Sadow understood what that improvisation revealed. The act of rolling lightened everything. The suitcase shifted from burden to companion. That difference, once felt, was hard to forget. From that hallway test to the next step came natural progression. Sadow worked for US Luggage. a family-owned company in Massachusetts, which gave him space and tools to refine the design. He built sturdier versions, experimenting with placement until 4 casters sat neatly at each corner of the case. The strap remained plain yet strong, long enough to let the user walk upright while leading the suitcase along. By late 1970, the design was stable enough that he patented it, an official recognition that a suitcase with wheels and a pull strap was something new. That same winter, Sadow arranged for the invention to meet real travelers. His company introduced the suitcase as the rollaway, displayed in department stores where customers could try pulling it across the floor. The first retail tests appeared at Macy's, a high-profile showcase for any product, promising to reshape daily routines. Even in its earliest form, slightly clunky, prone to tip if turned too fast, the bag held the remarkable difference he had noticed in the airport terminal. One simple alteration carried immense potential. 4 casters and a strap changed not only the object itself, but the experience of travel. A suitcase that rolled meant freedom from the constant ache of lifting and carrying, yet the reaction to this new form was not the obvious acceptance one might expect. Later accounts suggest many executives frowned at it first, and store buyers hesitated with skepticism. Sadow knew from the sound of those wheels in his home hallway that he had unlocked something important. Yet stepping from invention to acceptance proved far less smooth. That is where the story turns again. What Sadow carried into meetings was not just a suitcase, but a challenge to long-standing habits. What he met in return was rarely applause. The boardroom doubts. What happened inside those meetings was not the triumph Sadow had hoped for. When he carried his new suitcase into the offices of department store buyers, the sight was met with long silences and doubtful looks. He had a patent, a working model, and the lived proof that it made travel easier. Yet, across polished tables, the buyers' reactions landed somewhere between polite curiosity and quiet dismissal. The boardrooms themselves were ordinary enough. Wooden tables, bright fluorescents, men in tailored suits filling their notebooks with neat lines that rarely moved beyond the first page. In that setting, the suitcase did not look like grand innovation. To Sadow, it was a relief, a heavy bag that no longer pulled a shoulder down. But to the executives watching, it seemed uncertain. They studied the bag trundling on 4 casters with a thin strap, unsure whether to call it useful or absurd. Beneath those glances ran clear doubts tied less to mechanics than to image. Several buyers voiced the thought out loud. Would any man willingly be seen dragging his case behind him? Travel, to them, had long lived within a code. A suitcase was meant to be lifted. Strength was implied in the act. To place it on wheels raised fears of looking unmanly, a word that has since appeared again and again in later accounts of these early meetings. Some buyers hinted that perhaps women travellers might adopt such a device. Practicality made sense in that context, but as a men's product they could not imagine it taking hold. Technical flaws gave the critics an easier surface to stand on. Early prototypes tipped if pulled too quickly. A sharp turn or shiny flaw revealed their instability. Demonstrations ended with the suitcase leaning at angles or twisting sideways, its casters catching with a noisy jiggle. Sadow knew these were fixable details, but in a showroom under fluorescent lights, they looked like failings rather than the beginning of refinement. Buyers thought of complaints, possible ridicule, and the safe cycle of the luggage market they already understood. Why risk a gimmick that might backfire? Risk was the key word in every reluctance. The luggage business, though rarely glamorous, was steady. Customers bought strong leather cases, the same basic form repeated over decades. Brass locks, stitched seams, smooth handles. This was what sold. Attempting to shift that tradition with wheels was not just a gamble, but, in some minds, an unnecessary one. A failed trend could bruise a store's reputation, and no buyer wished to be linked to a product laughed at in public. Macy's executives in particular illustrate this pattern. At first, their buyers rejected the idea outright. They saw little place for it on the selling floor and doubted its reception among their customers. The only reason the rollaway did not stop there altogether was the support of Sadow's employer, the head of US Luggage, who stood behind the design when external approval was scarce. With backing from within his company, Sadow continued pressing forward, despite cool receptions outside those walls. After persistence and repeated demonstrations, Macy's did eventually agree to stock the suitcase in 1970. Even then, the acceptance carried boundaries. The advertising leaned deliberately toward images of women using the bag, stepping neatly through terminals with the strap in hand. This was no accident. The buyers still assumed that men would refuse the product on grounds of appearance, and so the marketing focus carefully avoided confronting that resistance directly. If women adopted it first, opinion might slowly shift until broader culture caught up. That long wait between boardroom rejection and retail appearance framed the Inventions' fragile beginnings. For Sadow, every demonstration repeated the same story, a machine that felt obvious and necessary, yet seen by decision-makers as risky and unserious. His own certainty about the ease of rolling was not matched across conference tables lined with folded arms. Silence or faintly amused smiles served as refusal more often than words did. Each quiet rejection might have been the end of the experiment, but instead it pressed him into further persistence. When the rollaway finally appeared on Macy's shelves at the close of 1970, it was hardly an overnight revolution. A few curious travelers noticed the new design and took the chance. Many others passed by. The case itself rattled and tipped as easily as earlier prototypes, and for every glance of interest, there was also a murmur of doubt. Still, the breakthrough was real. Rolling luggage had stepped out of patents and boardrooms into the hands of the public. That change, small as it was, began to show in airports soon after. Among the wide concourses and long walks between gates, a few travellers could now be seen pulling rather than carrying. The moment was still tentative, half hidden by the weight of tradition and the laughter of onlookers. But it marked the first movement toward a different rhythm in travel. And so, as 1971 arrived, the sight of one-wheeled suitcase sliding behind its owner hinted at more than simple convenience. It was the earliest proof that the public itself might judge the invention differently than the cautious men in boardrooms had expected. The next question was how it felt to be one of those early travellers stepping into an airport with a bag that rolled. First travellers to try. Imagine yourself walking through a terminal in 1971, the kind with patterned carpets and long echoing halls, while leading a suitcase that doesn't bite into your palm but instead rolls across the floor. The sound surprises you. Little casters tapping against tiles, the strap pulling soft at your wrist. A child stares with wide eyes, tugging at a parent's sleeve. A pair of young men point and chuckle as though you've brought a toy into a place meant for seriousness. That attention feels sharp, but behind it rests a quieter truth. Movement is easier, your shoulder unburdened, your hand no longer raw. The mocking glances pass, yet the absence of pain stays with you. For the first travellers, this was both freedom and discomfort. Order-defined airports then, uniformed clerks, measured lines, everyone carrying their own cases by hand. To pull a suitcase broke the rhythm. Where others hefted leather boxes against coats or switched arms to fight fatigue, the wheeled case looked like an interruption. Some saw humour, some saw novelty, and a few paused long enough to study how much less strained that traveller looked. The reactions mixed, curiosity and ridicule sharing the same space. The suitcase itself explained the tension. At a glance, the rollaway looked like any other. Rigid frame, corner caps, metal locks. The difference was hidden underfoot. 4 swivelling casters sat at its base, the same kind of wheels used on filing cabinets. A stout fabric strap ran along the front, letting the user bend slightly and tow the suitcase behind, but its narrow base led to problems. Quick steps tilted the bag sideways. A slight turn sent it spinning toward walls or knees. On uneven floors it rattled and skidded. To use it meant awkward adjustments, steady hands, and sometimes embarrassment. Relief balanced against these flaws. In wide corridors, the benefit was real. Weight shifted to the floor instead of the arm. A parent could pull a suitcase while still holding a child's hand. A traveller could walk with a free shoulder rather than stop every few minutes to swap grips. Yet stairs, escalators, or even sharp corners returned them to the old struggle, lifting or bracing the case again, drawing more stairs as straps twisted. Travel was lighter, but only slightly, and only in the right places. Reviews during the decade reflected the hesitation. By the mid-1970s, consumer magazines in Europe and the United States tested wheeled suitcases, pulling them across mocked-up concourses to see if the promise held. Many failed quickly. Casters stuck, straps tore, frames tipped when weight shifted to one side. In Britain, the magazine Which ran such trials between 1974 and 1978, and often concluded the designs were clever but unreliable. For years, the wheeled suitcase lingered as a novelty, noticed enough for the press to mention, but never trusted as standard. Adoption stretched slowly across the decade, with many travellers still preferring the old reliable rectangles. One line of sturdier bags stood apart. Swedish brand Cavalier produced models that consumer tests rated more favourably, proving that with better engineering the idea could stand. In the meantime, public reaction continued to waver. Some travellers, thrilled by the lighter pull, told their friends that rolling cases felt like a secret discovery. Others tried once, found the tipping awkward, and left the bag at home on future flights. Families especially leaned toward them. Parents managing children valued the extra freedom of a hand left open. Business travellers often hesitated longer. For men in pressed suits, the fear of looking silly outweighed the hope of comfort. Airports themselves became small theatres where both sides played out, one traveller tugging a rolling case under observations from dozens who still shouldered their loads. These mixed scenes led people to ask quiet questions. Was it vanity to want travel made easier, or stubbornness to refuse that help? Could convenience win against the weight of image and tradition? The design carried both answers at once. It worked but looked clumsy. It solved pain yet attracted stares. Standing in the middle of a concourse with such a suitcase meant negotiating not just corridors, but also the moving judgment of strangers. Through the 1970s, the wheeled suitcase lived in that middle ground, present but uncertain, tolerated but rarely embraced. Sales moved in small numbers, enough that the product never vanished, not yet strong enough to reshape the market. You could find them in department stores, tucked in among racks of traditional leather luggage. You could spot the occasional traveller pulling one across terminals, catching attention whether they wanted it or not. But you could not call them common. Most passengers still carried their weight in arms and shoulders, marching as travellers always had. In hindsight, those early adopters look less like outliers and more like markers of what was possible. They proved that anyone could, in fact, roll instead of lift. They also proved the limitations: swerving casters, awkward straps, designs not yet matched to the complexity of air travel. Their experience showed progress, but also pointed clearly toward what was missing. For the shift to become permanent, the suitcase needed more than a few brave buyers. It needed a design that felt stable rather than shaky, one that slid easily through narrow aisles, held weight upright, and carried professional confidence instead of comedic novelty. Beyond sturdier parts, it needed an example set by people whose presence in airports was constant, people whose choices would be watched and copied by the thousands who saw them pass each day. That next chapter didn't emerge from a glossy advertisement or another boardroom pitch. It surfaced instead in the place where luggage was tested daily, under the eyes of crews who lived among gates and concourses more than anyone else. The pilot's Rollaboard. What if the real shift in luggage design came not from traditional manufacturers, but from someone walking concourses every day as part of the job? By the late 1980s, Robert Plath was doing exactly that as a pilot with Northwest Airlines. His routine was constant and matter-of-fact. Pre-dawn departures, crowded service corridors, waiting hours in lounges before rushing to another gate. For him and his colleagues, airports were not places visited a few times a year but second homes. In those conditions, bulky suitcases with 4 small casters felt unworkable. They tipped, spun into ankles, and took too much space in jet bridges and cabins that already felt narrow. For airline crews, every inch and every movement mattered, and their existing luggage offered almost no help. Plath responded by reimagining what a suitcase should look like. Instead of repeating the old 4-caster model that wobbled in every direction, he altered the balance entirely. The redesign rested on 3 core changes: 2 larger wheels set at the back, so the bag tilted and rolled with stability, an upright stance so it could rest on its base without collapsing sideways, and a telescoping handle that pulled straight rather than at a crooked angle. Together, these adjustments stripped away the frustrations of older rolling bags and gave crews a practical carry-on that could move quickly and predictably down tight spaces. In 1989, Plath patented the design, and a few years later, around 1992, he began selling it through a company he called Travel Pro. The name he gave his model, the Rollaboard, summed up its purpose in one word. At first, the adoption spread only within his own circles. Flight attendants noticed that Plath's bag glided down jet bridges without cutting into his hands or jolting sideways into the wall. They compared his steady pace to the awkward shuffle caused by their own sagging shoulder bags and unsteady casters. One by one, they asked if he could build another. Soon, small batches appeared, passed from one crew member to the next. There were no billboards, no glossy campaigns. It was word of mouth, beginning behind the scenes where the professionalism of airline crews set the tone. The crew-centered path mattered. Unlike casual travelers, crews worked with luggage hundreds of times a year. They relied on it during long-haul connections, overnight layovers, and in the rush of boarding passengers. They understood in an instant whether a detail worked or failed. For them, compact size and reliable motion weren't luxuries. They were survival tools for a daily routine. Plath's Rollaboard addressed those needs so directly that it became trusted equipment long before it became fashionable. And when airline staff began appearing throughout airports with these upright two-wheel bags in hand, passengers took notice. Airports themselves acted as public stages. Travellers waiting in rows could not help watching the crews, how they stood, how they moved, even what luggage followed behind them. When every pilot or attendant passed through with the same upright bag rolling smoothly, the image carried weight. What might have looked gimmicky in a department store now signalled authority. These were not test models or unlikely novelties. They were tools used by people who knew the work of travel best. The association changed perception, turning a practical fix into an aspiration. By the early 1990s, TravelPro began to sell rollerboards beyond crew rooms and into general markets. Business travellers paid attention first. They recognized the professional origins and saw how easily the bags fit into overhead compartments. Families followed soon after, valuing the chance to keep one hand free for children while gliding luggage behind the other. The changes in everyday sounds made the shift clear. Airports that once echoed with grunts of effort and the drag of heavy bags began to hum steadily with two wheels rolling against tile. The quiet rhythm of the rollerboard became a new constant. The difference these adjustments made seems almost modest on paper. 2 wheels instead of 4, a vertical stance, a handle that bends and extends. Nothing dramatic. And yet each feature chipped away at a pain point that had shadowed decades of travellers. Where the Sadow model had solved carrying weight, but struggled with tipping and straps, Plath removed nearly every awkward movement. His solution was not unusual in concept. Suitcases had already rolled for years in other forms, but it was the first to fit smoothly into both the demands of crew work and the spaces of modern aircraft cabins. That balance made it sustainable, not just experimental. Passengers did not need advertising copy to be convinced. They needed only to watch a flight attendant turning a rollerboard smoothly along a concourse, or sliding it briskly into an overhead bin without fuss. In that small moment of observation, the contrast revealed itself. One traveller choking a shoulder strap versus a professional walking upright, one hand barely guiding a steady case. The proof lived in plain sight, in the lived routines of people who carried no patience for gimmicks. No one could guess in the early 1990s how firmly this quiet pattern would take hold. But within a few years, upright rolling bags had become the new standard image of air travel. The adoption was so thorough that it reshaped not only what people bought, but also how airports sounded and looked. The heavy pauses between strides lightened, replaced by travellers walking at a more even pace, bags trailing silently behind them. An era that started with curiosity and laughter at wheeled luggage had yielded to a period in which the rolling sound of travel was simply normal. Looking back, the influence of Plath's Rollaboard feels understated, almost calm. It grew from necessity rather than ambition, guided first by daily use instead of corporate launch. By the time it reached the wider market, its credibility was already established, built not on glossy images, but on the authority of crews who depended on it. That foundation gave the design a permanence missing from earlier attempts. Soon, to imagine airports without upright rolling bags would feel strange. The success of the Rollaboard also signaled that one design could reset expectations across the entire field. Travellers had seen weight shift to wheels in Sadow's time, but now they saw stability, comfort and trust carried into a form that matched modern airports. That shift laid the groundwork for new experiments. For once, people grew accustomed to their bags moving smoothly behind them. It was not long before engineers and companies began wondering, could travel be made even lighter, even more effortless, even closer to the sensation of simply gliding forward? Spinners and smooth hauls. Did you notice how many suitcases now glide upright beside their owners, as though they hardly weigh anything at all? That easy motion wasn't always possible. For years we tilted bags back on two wheels, tugging at straps or handles while leaning our shoulders forward through long concourses. Then, in 2004, Samsonite introduced its Sadow line, the first major four-wheel spinner collection, and airports began filling with travellers pushing luggage that no longer trailed behind, but rolled steadily beside them. The difference was immediate to anyone who tried. Instead of a burden pulling against one arm, the suitcase could be guided lightly with a fingertip on the telescoping handle. Each of the four wheels rotated freely in any direction, so a traveller could turn sharply in a crowded gate or shift sideways through boarding lines without lifting. What might have seemed a small change quickly revealed itself as a new way of moving. After years of dragging cases across polished stone, the spinner shifted the rhythm of airports into something calmer and less strained. This change also pointed quietly to physics. Research shows that traditional two-wheel designs can wobble under certain conditions, tipping or rocking if pulled unevenly. It was part of the reason they often felt awkward when rushing between gates. The spinner's four-wheel base reduced that instability and allowed smoother, more predictable paths. It was not perfect. Tiny wheels still caught on cracks or curbs outside, but inside sprawling terminals, the design solved the problem that mattered most: the long walk across smooth floors. Samsonite's launch made the feature mainstream, but the appeal spread quickly. Travellers noticed how simple it felt to steer the bags upright, like a steady cart instead of a swaying box. Parents pushing a child's stroller could now guide their suitcase with the other hand. Older travellers, tired of stopping to adjust a shoulder strap, felt more able to move steadily through security lines without pausing. In an airport filled with movement and queues, the spinner's mobility seemed almost designed for that specific environment. The earlier spinners, however, had their limits. What looked graceful indoors could turn clumsy outdoors. On cobblestones or uneven sidewalks, the wheels twisted unpredictably and lost their smooth glide. Most owners learned to tip the bag onto two wheels again, treating it more like the older Rollaboard when conditions demanded. But inside airports where the floors stretched glossy and level, the benefit was undeniable. Rows of travellers no longer staggered under the same tension. Their hands rested gently on upright bags that seemed to float along at their side. At the same time, airlines were tightening cabin rules. Smaller weight limits and stricter dimensions meant travellers wanted lighter luggage. Manufacturers responded by pairing spinner wheels with thin polycarbonate shells that saved pounds without losing strength. It was a natural fit, a case that was both light enough to meet airline rules and easy enough to steer with two fingers. Glossy shells also shifted the look of luggage. Bright silver, red and polished blue replaced the muted browns of earlier decades, and since spinners stood upright, these colours were visible in every waiting line. Airports themselves seemed built for this transition. As terminals expanded in the early 2000s, their concourses widened and their surfaces smoothed. Tile floors replaced carpets in many areas. Spaces were shaped to move large groups quickly between security and gates. Spinners matched those spaces perfectly. Watching an entire queue shuffle forward with bags gliding quietly alongside their owners showed how naturally this design settled into its environment. The hum of soft wheels on polished tile became part of the modern airport soundscape. Not everyone was convinced at first. Some worried about fragile wheels or clung to the sturdier two-wheel bags they trusted. Yet adoption often depends less on specifications and more on what people see around them. The sight of someone maneuvering easily through a tight crowd, suitcase rotating neatly without collision, persuaded more than any advertisement. Pier by pier, the four-wheel design spread until dragging a tilted bag on two wheels looked awkwardly old-fashioned. By the close of the 2000s, spinners were no longer considered gadgets. They became standard. Manufacturers built entire product lines around the format in every size and style. Children guided cases with ease. Seniors moved without stopping to rest their shoulders. Families stepped through long arrivals halls, steering bags lightly with one hand. What had seemed an experiment in 2004 became expectation within a decade. All of this, however, was more than engineering. The real story lay in how travellers felt. When a bag glided instead of strained, small barriers fell away. Long walks became less of an ordeal. Security lines moved more smoothly without so many back-and-forth adjustments. The experience of travel shifted from endurance to something closer to cooperation. The bag worked with you rather than against you. And while the improvements in design and materials mattered, what stood out most was the quiet relief across ordinary journeys. The hum of spinner wheels on tile carried something subtle. Access. People of different ages with more or less strength now had an easier path through the same wide spaces. In that sense, the significance of spinners reached beyond style or technology, which leads us gently to a more personal question. Not only how luggage moves, but how it changes who gets to move with it. The human difference. Imagine a grandparent stepping off a flight, leaning softly on the handrail as they walk down the jet bridge. Years ago, the thought of carrying bags across crowded arrivals might have made the journey impossible. Now, with a suitcase rolling upright beside them, the walk into the arms of waiting family is less about strain and more about reunion. Weight that once felt like a barrier is carried quietly by wheels. Picture a parent guiding a restless toddler through a busy terminal. One hand is stretched out for the child, steady and protective. The other hand rests lightly on a suitcase that rolls along on its own. Without wheels, their movements would be tangled, arms full of both child and luggage. With a rolling bag, attention shifts to what matters most, keeping the child safe amidst the crowd. Now think of someone recovering from an injury, perhaps still stiff after a surgery. Carrying a heavy case might risk pain or undo progress, leaving travel too daunting. But with a rolling suitcase, effort becomes guidance rather than lifting. The case follows at a gentle pull. Travel that once seemed unavailable becomes possible again. Independence restored through a small change in design. These vignettes point toward the same truth. The rolling suitcase did more than change how bags moved through airports. It lowered the barrier to travel itself. A design that seemed trivial on paper made long trips accessible to people who once had to choose between pain and staying home. Rolling wheels did not invent travel, but they widened its reach. The public health picture tells the same story. Even today, with nearly every traveller pulling a suitcase on wheels, lifting still causes harm. US emergency room records show tens of thousands of luggage-related injuries each year. One report counted nearly 54,000 in 2012, while later figures noted emergency treatments climbing from about 73,000 in 2014 to around 84,000 in 2015. If accidents remain common even with rolling luggage, imagine the toll in decades when every suitcase was carried by hand from curb to gate. Behind the familiar hum of wheels lies a quieter gain: fewer strained backs, fewer exhausted shoulders, and fewer travellers forced to recover instead of enjoy their journeys. The cultural story is just as telling. In the early 1970s, passengers who pulled rolling bags were often met with smirks or dismissive comments. A suitcase dragged along the floor suggested weakness, and popular culture occasionally treated it as a joke. Yet over time, the meaning reversed. Today, the traveller who insists on carrying heavy leather cases looks out of step, while wheeled luggage signals common sense. Rolling a bag came to mean practicality, not indulgence. This shift shows how our sense of strength can change. For much of the 20th century, lifting heavy bags was proof of endurance. Over time, the smarter choice became letting the bag carry itself. The measure of strength moved away from strain and toward efficiency. Arriving at a destination relaxed rather than sore became the mark of confidence. With that change, the rolling suitcase turned from a symbol of dependence into a simple sign of independence. Through this lens, the invention was more than a convenience. It was inclusion. The grandparent arriving without fear of exhaustion, the parent guiding a child with free hands, the traveller regaining confidence after an injury, all became part of the crowd. Airports that had once been shaped by who was able-bodied enough to endure them grew more open. Each small set of wheels brought people into motion who otherwise might have been left behind. And these changes came not from advertising campaigns or luxury branding, but from countless private decisions. Travellers who chose the lighter way kept repeating the act until it replaced old habits. Inventors who met dismissal continued refining the design until it stayed. The wheel under a suitcase proved that progress often comes softly, without fanfare, until suddenly it feels ordinary. So when we think about what rolling luggage made possible, the story is less about engineering diagrams and more about human difference. Each smooth glide is a reminder of how much struggle has been removed. Each hand left free, each body spared from strain, adds to a larger pattern. Instead of travel being a test of strength, it became a more even ground where more people could take part. In that sense, the suitcase on wheels was not just a product, it was a bridge. It allowed more of us to walk into arrivals with energy left to embrace family, to guide children, to look ahead instead of merely recover from the burden behind us. Its most profound gift was not speed, but access, an equalizer that broadened who could go where. This is the quiet legacy worth noticing. Wheels turned luggage from an obstacle into a companion, and in doing so they changed the shape of travel itself. A tool that began as a curiosity became an essential, not only because it carried clothes more easily, but because it carried people more gently into the experiences they sought. From here, The story pulls us naturally to a final reflection. Many inventions we now take for granted pass through years of resistance before becoming part of daily life. The rolling suitcase was no different, and its history reminds us how persistence, patience, and small adjustments can shape the way we live. Conclusion. Behind every ordinary object lies a time when it felt unusual. The rolling suitcase, once doubted and even mocked, now moves quietly through nearly every terminal in the world. What began as frustration and a simple fix has become an unnoticed companion at your side. As you picture your own last trip, think of the bag you guided across the floor. Notice how it carried more than clothes. It carried away effort, left you freer to focus on the journey itself. Take a slow breath here. Let your shoulders soften and allow that thought to ease you toward rest. If you enjoyed this calm story, you're welcome to like or subscribe. It's entirely optional, just a gentle way to signal you'd like more. For now, set the weight of the day down, just as easily as a bag gliding on wheels, and let quiet carry you forward